Friends, if you've ever lived through a moment when silence became unbearable, when someone finally stood up and said what needed to be said, then this story will feel familiar. Just a few days ago, in the capital of Burkina Faso, a young African president named Ibrahim Traore walked into a crowded press room. No script, no teleprompter, just conviction. He looked into the camera and with a steady voice said, "We are no longer colonies, we are sovereign nations, and we will not be threatened." They say a warning came from the Prime Minister of Israel urging African leaders to stay in line. Whether the words were truly his or not didn't matter. The message rang out and so did the response. Traoré's reply wasn't just political, it was personal. And it struck a chord with millions. You could hear it in the stillness of that room. The kind of silence some of you may remember from your younger years when someone stood before a nation and refused to bow. Whether it was Martin Luther King Jr. speaking on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial or a young soldier testifying before Congress, those rare moments when courage breaks through fear. President Traoré's voice didn't stay in Burkina Faso. Within hours, it had reached farmers in Niger, students in South Africa, elders in Ghana. They didn't just hear a leader, they heard themselves, their frustrations, their hopes, their pride. So we ask, in today's world, should African nations still have to seek permission to live free? Should dignity be delayed for the sake of diplomacy? If these are questions you've quietly asked yourself, then this space is for you. You're watching a channel that doesn't speak for Africa. We listen to it. Please share this video if you believe every nation has the right to stand tall. Subscribe if you still believe that truth is more important than the narrative. It began not with a declaration of war, but with a quiet resolve, one man, one podium, one message that echoed across a continent. On that day in Ouagadougou, the capital of Burkina Faso, President Ibrahim Traore walked into the press room alone. The room was packed. No teleprompters, no handlers whispering behind him, just a nation watching, holding its breath. There had been whispers of a warning, something allegedly said by Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. A threat, they said, directed at African leaders fall in line or face consequences. Whether or not Netanyahu truly spoke those words is still unclear, but to Traore, the message behind them was unmistakable. It was a tone Africa has heard too many times before, threatening, dismissive, colonial in spirit. And this time, someone chose not to stay silent. "I don't care whether he said it or not," Traore began. The message was loud and it was clear. What followed was not a rant, not a protest, but a moment of deep moral clarity. He didn't shout, he didn't raise a fist, he spoke plainly. The way a father might speak to protect his home. The way a veteran might speak when the truth becomes too heavy to carry in silence. "We are not your colony. We are not your pawns," he said, looking directly into the camera. "We are sovereign, and we will fight for our freedom with everything we've got." He paused. The room, once murmuring, fell quiet. Then came the words that would ripple across Africa. "Let me make this crystal clear," Mr. Netanyahu Traore said, his voice calm but firm. "Burkina Faso does not answer to Tel Aviv. We don't answer to Washington. We don't answer to any force that thinks it can buy us or bomb us into obedience." In that moment, the silence in the room wasn't fear. It was recognition that something important had just happened. A shift. A line drawn. To many watching both inside Burkina Faso and across the broader African world, this was more than politics. This was personal. For decades, if not centuries, Africa has endured interference from outside forces, colonization, economic exploitation, military occupation, conditional aid. The words Traore spoke carried not just his voice, but the memory of ancestors, the burden of history, and the rising fire of a new generation demanding change. But the speech didn't stop there. With steady eyes, he warned, "If you come for one of us, you come for all of us." It was a message to all foreign powers, not just Israel, but any nation that views Africa as a place to extract, manipulate, or divide. This wasn't the first time an African leader had spoken about sovereignty, but something felt different now. The mood had shifted. The people were listening. Because this moment didn't come out of nowhere. In the past year alone, Burkina Faso has expelled French military forces, cut ties with exploitative foreign contracts, and restructured its government to reflect local needs, not foreign expectations. Mali and Niger have done the same. Together, these nations have begun to form what is now called the Sahel Alliance, a regional bloc committed to mutual protection, economic independence, and a rejection of neo-colonial influence. So when Traore spoke, it wasn't just for Burkina Faso. It was for a region, a generation, a continent. He knew the risks. He knew how the media might portray him. Unstable, reckless, dangerous. But he also knew that history never remembers the quiet leaders who waited their turn. It remembers those who dared to speak when speaking was costly, and the cost of silence in this case was far too high. Within hours, video clips of the speech began circulating on X, Telegram, and WhatsApp. Not from government PR teams, but from everyday people who had recorded it, shared it, and said he speaks for me. Elders in Ghana, mothers in Senegal, young activists in South Africa, farmers in Niger. They didn't hear a rebel, they heard a leader. The speech may have been delivered in a quiet room in Ouagadougou, but its aftershocks traveled far and wide. What happened next turned a moment of defiance into a movement of solidarity. Within minutes of President Traoré's address, the clip began circulating online. But it wasn't a polished government broadcast. It was raw, handheld footage. Someone had filmed it on their phone. That made it more powerful, more real. It started on WhatsApp and Telegram, spreading through group chats between students in Bamako and community elders in Dakar. From there, it jumped onto X, formerly Twitter, where hashtags like Africa Will Not Bow, We Stand with Traore, and Sahel Rising began trending. By nightfall, the message had reached across borders. In Mali, Colonel Assimi Goïta, the transitional president and longtime ally of Traore, posted the clip with only one sentence beneath it: "He speaks for all of us." In Guinea, President Mamadi Doumbouya took to national television and echoed the message word for word, stating, "Guinea does not answer to Tel Aviv. We do not answer to Paris. We answer to our people." It wasn't coordinated, it wasn't planned, but it was authentic. And that's why it caught fire. Young people across Africa began to organize sovereignty circles, small gatherings in homes, universities, and even church halls where they would replay the speech, discuss its meaning, and talk about what it would take to make Africa truly free. Some painted murals, others printed shirts with Traoré's image and the words, "We are not your colony." In Niger, farmers gathered at dawn in a village square. One elder stood with a rusted radio in his hand and quietly said, "My father died under colonial rule. My son will not." Even in South Africa, a country far from the Sahel's sand and struggles, the impact was clear. Activists who had spent years battling economic inequality and land injustice began quoting Traoré in their rallies. Freedom, they chanted, is not a gift, it is a fight. But perhaps the most remarkable response came not from the streets, but from the silence of foreign governments. Israel issued no statement. The United States Department of State offered no comment. France, which had previously condemned Burkina Faso's withdrawal from its military presence, suddenly fell quiet. That silence to many in Africa said more than words ever could. It said they were caught off guard. They weren't prepared for a leader like Traoré, young, composed, educated, unapologetic. A soldier-turned-statesman who didn't wait for permission, who didn't ask for validation, who simply stood up and spoke a truth so many had carried in their hearts. The Western media predictably handled it differently. In Washington and London, most newsrooms ignored the story altogether. When they did mention it, the tone was cautious, referring to controversial comments and unverified allegations. They focused not on the message, but on the optics, the uniform, the military background, the anti-Western rhetoric. But that only strengthened the resolve in Africa, because people could see the pattern. When an African leader submits, they call him stable. When he resists, they call him dangerous. So they embraced the danger. One woman in Senegal wrote on her community board, "If sovereignty is dangerous, then let us all be dangerous." Meanwhile, religious leaders across West Africa began invoking Traoré's message in sermons. In one mosque in Burkina Faso, the imam spoke of a new season of courage. In a Christian church in Togo, the pastor told his congregation, "There is no shame in standing up, only shame in kneeling forever." Even artists got involved. A song titled "Ouaga Doesn't Bow" went viral on YouTube, blending traditional kora music with modern beats and samples from the speech itself. The refrain: "We do not answer to Tel Aviv. We do not answer to Washington. We answer to our children's future." For older Africans, especially those who remembered the independence struggles of the 1960s, this moment stirred a deep emotion. Letters poured in to radio stations. One retired teacher in Côte d'Ivoire wrote, "We marched for freedom once. Now our grandchildren must finish the march." In the diaspora, from Harlem to Brixton, from Toronto to Marseille, the response was just as strong. African Americans and Afro-Caribbeans shared the clip widely. Some saw parallels with their own history, the civil rights movement, the fight against segregation, the calls for Black power. Others simply felt pride that Africa had found a voice that refused to whisper. But not all reactions were celebratory. Some regional leaders, particularly those still aligned with Western donors, distanced themselves. They feared backlash. They feared sanctions. But they also feared what Traoré's boldness might awaken in their own people. And yet the people were already awake. In every direction, the ground was shifting. This wasn't just a headline, it was a signal that Africa long underestimated and often dismissed was speaking with a new voice. And millions were ready to listen. In the weeks that followed President Traoré's speech, the effects rippled far beyond social media and trending hashtags. What began as a bold declaration of sovereignty began transforming into tangible shifts both inside Burkina Faso and across the Sahel. The first signs came from the streets. In Ouagadougou, young people began organizing what they called sovereignty cleanups. Ordinary citizens gathering to repair schools, paint walls, plant gardens, and restore neglected public spaces. If we say we are free, one young woman told a local reporter, then let's live like it. Let's rebuild this country ourselves. Unlike past protest movements, this was not about confrontation. It was about construction. It wasn't just youth. Veterans, men who had fought under colonial banners decades ago, began volunteering at local training centers, offering skills in carpentry, welding, and basic healthcare. We were trained to serve foreign armies, said one gray-haired sergeant. Now, we serve our own children. For the first time in years, there was a sense that government and citizen were speaking the same language. Ministries rolled out neighborhood-led initiatives, public land made available for cooperative farming community centers, funded not by aid, but by local unions and faith groups. The message was clear: development doesn't need to come in a foreign envelope. But while the civic awakening inspired many, it also disrupted the status quo. Inside the political class, tensions simmered. Not all officials were ready for the shift in tone or responsibility. Some bureaucrats accustomed to foreign consultants and external funding found themselves scrambling to navigate a new system grounded in local control. The president had cut off several aid programs that were seen as tools of influence rather than genuine partnership. With them went the perks, the travel budgets, and the quiet dependency that had long shaped policymaking in Francophone Africa. Diplomats from France, the European Union, and the United States requested meetings. Most were cordial. But behind closed doors, pressure mounted. Do you intend to realign away from Western development partners? One ambassador reportedly asked. We intend, Traoré replied, to realign toward our people. At the National Assembly, younger legislators, many in their 30s and 40s, began introducing bills rooted in sovereignty, economic reform, land access for women, the creation of a public bank to replace French-backed lenders. Older members used to more conservative politics tried to stall. But public opinion had shifted, and with it the balance of power. Some commentators compared the moment to post-war South Korea or even post-colonial India, a time when national pride overcame political inertia. But others warned that pride alone wasn't policy. The government would need to deliver quickly on its promises or risk losing the momentum. Security also became a major concern. With the withdrawal of French troops and the rejection of foreign military bases, Burkina Faso faced new risks, particularly from insurgent groups along its northern borders. But here again, the response was homegrown. Instead of relying on foreign contractors, the government recruited and trained thousands of young volunteers into local defense units. These weren't mercenaries. They were sons and daughters defending their own communities. Meanwhile, regional coordination accelerated. The Sahel Alliance, once a loose idea, began taking shape with joint patrols, intelligence sharing, and economic task forces. Ministers from Mali and Niger visited Ouagadougou to sign new energy and infrastructure agreements aimed not just at resisting pressure, but at creating shared prosperity. One journalist called it Africa's quiet revolution. But on the ground, there was nothing quiet about it. There were town hall meetings, late-night radio shows, and kitchen table conversations, each one wrestling with the same question: what does it truly mean to be free? In schools, that question became a curriculum. Textbooks once imported from Europe were replaced by locally authored materials. History classes began teaching not just colonial timelines, but the stories of African kings, queens, scientists, and resistance leaders. In one rural classroom, a teacher asked her students, "What do you want the world to know about Burkina Faso?" A boy raised his hand and said, "That we are not poor, we are rebuilding." But not everyone welcomed the change. Former elites, those who had benefited from foreign contracts and backdoor diplomacy, began voicing concerns. Some warned of economic collapse, isolation, or military retaliation. Yet the people were unmoved. They had heard these warnings before. And they had watched for decades as those same leaders built personal wealth while villages stayed in darkness. This time, they wanted something different. And in Ibrahim Traore, many saw a leader not above them, but beside them. A man who had put his own life at risk, not to hold on to power, but to hand it back to the people. Whether or not this bold new direction would succeed was still uncertain. But one thing was clear: the old model had been broken. And in its place, something real, something African was beginning to grow. While Africa stirred with new energy, the West particularly, the United States watched with a quiet, unsettled gaze. In Washington, the official response to President Traoré's remarks was silence. No press release, no condemnation, no praise. But inside think tanks and diplomatic circles, the discussion was far from quiet. Analysts at the State Department flagged the speech as a sentiment-shifting moment, one that could influence not just Burkina Faso, but the broader geopolitical balance in the Sahel. What troubled U.S. and European policymakers wasn't just the rhetoric, it was the speed at which it resonated. A message that rejected foreign influence, promoted regional unity, and called out Western dominance had become popular across borders almost overnight. That's not something policymakers had prepared for. In a closed-door session at the Atlantic Council, a former ambassador to West Africa reportedly asked, "What if this becomes the new model? Young leaders, military backgrounds, no tolerance for Western paternalism." The room was quiet. For decades, the United States has approached Africa through a familiar framework: development aid, security partnerships, and pro-democracy initiatives. But Traoré's Burkina Faso wasn't asking for aid. It was asking to be left alone to build. That in many ways posed a more complex challenge than conflict ever could. Across the Atlantic, in Brussels and Paris, the anxiety was more visible. France, in particular, had seen its military influence evaporate from Mali, Niger, and now Burkina Faso. But beyond the loss of bases and contracts, something deeper had been shaken: the illusion of control. In media circles, major outlets like the New York Times and BBC largely avoided covering the full context of Traoré's speech. When they did, the framing focused on anti-Western rhetoric or military populism. But on social platforms, especially in African and diaspora communities, the sentiment was clear: this was not extremism, it was emancipation. And yet, among many Americans, especially older generations who remember the civil rights movement and the long arc of global justice, Traoré's words sparked something familiar: a call to stand, to reclaim dignity, to choose self-determination over dependence. As global alliances realign, the question is not whether the world will accept a stronger Africa. It is whether it can understand it. History rarely gives warning before it turns a page, but sometimes, if you're listening closely, you can hear the rustle. President Ibrahim Traoré's words in Ouagadougou may well be one of those moments. This wasn't just a speech to confront a foreign prime minister. It was a reckoning long overdue with the way Africa has been treated, talked about, and managed from afar. For many Western leaders, the real shock wasn't what he said, it was how many millions stood up and said, "He speaks for me." But here's the caution: when voices like Traoré rise, so too do efforts to silence them. We've seen this story before, in Latin America, in Southeast Asia, even in Africa's own past. When leaders challenge the global order, they often find themselves isolated, discredited, or worse. And when that happens, it's not just the leader who suffers, it's the people, the dream, the momentum. That is why this moment matters, not just for Burkina Faso, not just for the Sahel, but for anyone who believes in dignity over dependency. We're watching the early chapters of something much larger, a continental awakening led not by billionaires or diplomats, but by farmers, students, elders, and soldiers who remember what it means to be self-reliant. And it raises urgent questions not only for Africa, but for us here in the West. Can we listen without controlling? Can we support without steering? Can we let Africa stand tall even if it challenges our comfort? Those are hard questions, but necessary ones. If you've come this far in the story, then maybe, just maybe, you're one of the few who still believe that truth deserves to be heard even when it makes us uncomfortable. So let me ask you this. Do you think President Ibrahim Traoré's national reform strategies are truly effective yet? Or is it still too soon to know what kind of future he's building? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. Share this video if you feel that you are one of the first to know about and support this rising moment in African history. And subscribe if you believe deep down that the truth is more important than the headlines. Africa is rising, and the world is watching.